We, the members of the Secret Order of Alchemical Actors, do solemnly commit ourselves to a full and honest telling of the history of the occult as far as we know it. My name is Dr. Rob C. Thompson, your supreme hierophant for the Secret Order of Alchemical Actors, joined this day by Luke Kinnaman, our Producia Discordia. Luke, what's up?
Hello. Still with the chickens.
Still with the chickens, adding a little ambiance to our recording today. Luke has got a very exciting guest for us that required some time management, right, to work this out, because we are talking across the Atlantic Ocean today with Tobias Churton.
Britain's leading scholar of Western esotericism, a world authority on Gnosticism, Hermeticism, and Rosicrucianism, is a filmmaker and the founding editor of the magazine Freemasonry Today, an honorary fellow of Exeter University, where he is faculty lecturer in Rosicrucianism and Freemasonry. He holds a master's degree in theology from, and you'll have to help me with this pronunciation,
Brasenose
College in Oxford, and created the award-winning documentary series and accompanying book, The Gnostics, as well as several other films on Christian doctrine, mysticism, and magical folklore. The author of many books, including Gnostic Philosophy, The Invisible History of Rosicrucians, and Aleister Crowley, The Beast in Berlin, and speaking to us today on his new book, The Books of Enoch Revealed. Tobias, hello.
Good afternoon.
So excited to have you, Tobias.
That's excellent, and I hope I can make it worth your while.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Just jumping straight in to give listeners kind of a better idea of where you're coming from with writing this book. What motivated you to kind of explore the Books of Enoch in the first place?
The Books of Enoch were, how can I say, they existed on the fringes of my studies when I was a student many years ago now, and were never properly integrated into the knowledge base of a Oxford theology graduate. But while I was working on a book on Gnostic philosophy back in the 90s, I happened to be in a bookshop in Oxford, and I saw the Book of Enoch in a decent translation going very cheaply. And I picked it up, and I thought, my goodness, it's time I read this. And I by the time I'd got home, I'd read it, and I was quite astonished at its quality, elevated character, and its interpretation and meaning, and was wondering why I'd never really come to grips with, I would call it the first Book of Enoch before. And it had quite an impact on my thought, and the more work I did, Enoch kept coming back, and every time with a kind of renewed force and sense of its importance and relevance. And that culminated in a few years ago. I wrote a book called the Lost Pillars of Enoch, and that was using the Lost Pillars of Enoch, which are the pillars containing all knowledge, supposedly erected before the flood, one of which was destroyed and another was allegedly survived into the time of the 1st century Christian era. And that book, well, it really did engage with Enoch, but it was perfectly obvious to me after attending the seminars of an international group of scholars called the Enoch Seminar that I'd got a lot of catching up to do in terms of the amount of scholarship that had been done on these works. And at the same time, I had a very powerful necessity, inner urge that I got to write the whole story for people like I was, who had potential to be inspired and affected by the Books of Enoch, but who didn't have a good starting text. And this is more than a starting text. It's a pretty comprehensive review of the entire corpus of Enochic writing, with all the best of the world scholarship that's gone on the subject since antique times, late antiquity, since Roman times. but also bringing it up to date with the incredible amount of scholarship that's been done in the last 30 years, where there's been a massive increase in interest and serious attention given to the books of Enoch. And they weren't taken seriously in the 70s when I was a student, not much in the 80s, but in the intervening years, their status has risen. And I think a lot of ordinary interested people, the so-called intelligent layperson, laywoman, need an authoritative review of what they might want to know about the books of Enoch, because there is an awful lot of prejudicial nonsense on the internet on the subject, both conservative and absurdly radical. The truth is, as always I find in my work, the truth is always more interesting than the fiction.
And more complicated, right?
Well, I suppose complication is what I'm here to unravel. What I try to do with all my work is take very difficult subjects that have become obscure or regarded as esoteric, like the Gordian knot of Alexander the Great's legend, and unravel these difficult areas. Now, obviously, unraveling a complex knot woven, as it were, over many centuries isn't a simple matter. You know, this isn't journalism. There are no obvious, easy answers. There are certain things that people have to think about for themselves. Other things people will bring their own interests into play, and everybody sees everything through a slightly different lens. Some lenses very different, but I think I've it depends what sort of books you want. If you want a sort of something you can sort of digest in 5 minutes, then I would suggest you didn't take too much interest in important subjects. You know, you're obviously used to light drink, light food, and if it's light you want, stay away from things that are inherently heavy and meaningful. If, however, you're a searching spirit, and the searching spirit is prepared to go to any depths or heights, the nature of spiritual liberties suggests that we have more capacities than we know, then I would say hitch a ride on one of my magic carpets.
That's good advice. Yeah, I don't hear that enough. If you're not ready for the heavy stuff, stay out of the water, right?
That's it. Exactly right. You know, we don't want people get drowned in their own vanity.
Right. Sure.
Perhaps we ought to introduce who we're talking about here when we say Enoch for a start. Might be a good idea. Right, yeah. Okay, just a quick pencil sketch. The Book of Genesis, everybody knows, is the first book of the Hebrew scripture, and there in chapters 5 and 6 are elements that then become fleshed out in the books of Enoch. There are classically 3 books of Enoch, but the first, what's known as First Enoch, is the most important. Enoch is presented in Genesis as the 7th in line from Adam, the 7th patriarch. So he's an antediluvian patriarch of humanity, not just of the Hebrew peoples, but in biblical terms, he's one of the founders of the human experience. We learn odd things, not much about this Enoch character. His name seems to mean something like dedicated, which doesn't tell us much, and I suppose you might say initiated. But it's something to do with dedication, it would seem, from the etymology of the Enoch being the Hebrew. Let's keep him in the Hebrew context at the moment, because there are people who think he's just a straight lift from Babylonian and Akkadian mythology and Sumerian mythology. He's based on a magician called Enmeduranki. That's a possibility, but that's not really relevant, because he's not presented as a magician in the Bible. It just says Enoch walked with God, and God took him. And this enigmatic little phrase has been built on quite substantially in its meaning. Enoch walked with God. What does that mean? Well, it means that he's runs his life, as it were, in consciousness of the divine presence and is completely acceptable to God. He's the kind of human being that God wants. So Enoch walked with God, and God took him. Now, this has generally been accepted as meaning that he did not die. He never pulled his last breath, but was taken to heaven directly while still alive. And that makes him a very key figure, because if he's gone to heaven in full consciousness, and then he must have a role in, not only a role, but he will have intimate knowledge of what's going on in heaven and the relations between the heavenly court of God and what's going on in the human plane on earth. So there we have it. That's what we get from Genesis about this character Enoch. In the first book of Enoch, which is the substantial collection of little books of Enoch, like the astronomical book, the Book of the Watchers, the Epistle of Enoch, and a later work, the Parables of Enoch, which is particularly interesting in Christian terms, we have a complete account, apocalyptic account in the proper meaning of the word apocalyptic, not in the modern one, account of what happened to God's creation that sent it wrong, and what God has been doing about it over the intervening period to the time of the writing of First Enoch. And those stories are themselves extraordinary. They may have been influenced by the very brief account in Genesis chapter 6 that many people will know about, of the Nephilim, where we're told that the sons of God being the angelic court up there, that the sons of God, or some of them, found themselves arrested by the sense that human women were so beautiful that they had to come down to earth and mate with them. Limited account we get in Genesis suggests that somehow this produced what they call Nephilim, which may mean the fallen, but is understood in Genesis as men of renown, which seems to be influenced by the Greek mythology of heroes who were partly of divine origin. Now, in the first book of Enoch, particularly in the Book of the Watchers, we have a much more radical view. These rebel angels, led by Shemhaza, gather together on Mount Hermon and make a pact. There are only a limited number of them, that they will bear a kind of equal responsibility for what they've done. And having made this pact, they then fall on the human women and produce giants of extraordinary size, thousands and thousands of feet high. And their offspring, because of the miscegenation of the nature of these misbirths, which should never have happened, are seen to be explained by the fact that because the angels do not marry in heaven, and they have immortality, when you combine that with human beings, you create a kind of monstrous, abortive catastrophe. And these giants proceed to make war on human beings, eat them, and generally ravage the entire world and destroy and corrupt the human experience profoundly. And in a very key line, it says, referring to another leader of these watchers, as they're called, the watchers, the wicked watchers, as opposed to the good watchers. The watchers are the angels in heaven looking down, as it were, watching. These wicked watchers are led at some point by a character called Azazel. And it says, to him ascribe all sin. Now, that line is very, very pregnant with implications. If sin has come into earth because of the activity of the angels, or the rebel angels, then it is something that human beings actually do not have the power to overcome totally. They might choose the righteous path, but ultimately sin is of a transcendent origin. And according to, say, Professor Gabriele Boccaccini, who's one of the foremost, if not in some sense the foremost Enoch scholar at Syracuse University, Michigan, he would say this is a distinctive aspect of Enochic literature. This is a complete theory of the origin of evil. So everything that happens subsequently has come about because of this rape of the human women. And although various theologians have argued whether it was rape or whether the women were in fact complicit, and some rabbis have suggested that in fact that it was the weakness of the human women and all this. People argue about that. But the text is fairly clear that it doesn't say whether the women were glad of it. It is presented as a violation of the divine order, such a violation that the prayers are sent to heaven, and the angel Raphael hears the prayers and brings the appeal of humanity to God and says, people are down there suffering, what are we going to do? And in the Book of the Watchers, what they do is they send Enoch, who's resident up there, fully apprised of the secrets of heaven, and he goes down to read the riot act to the Watchers just below Mount Hermon, and he has a certain amount of adventures there. And Azazel appeals to Enoch and says, please, please don't bring the wrath of the Lord on us. We know what it'll do. And he said, too late, mate. You know, you are finished. And the Lord is going to execute judgment in the first instance now, but in an ultimate sense also. Now, God's problem with the angels and with the giants is that the giants, being part angel and therefore have immortality, how do you punish them? How do you get rid of them? How do you imprison it? What do you do with an angel? He's immortal. You can't wipe him out, which would be the normal method. Well, first of all, it is implied in some of the texts that the flood itself, we know the Noah's flood, that was primarily an attempt to rid the world of the giants and all the evils that they'd done. But it leaves the spirits of the giants, and they have to be dealt with too. And this is how you get the origin of the idea of an eternal fire for the sinful, because you have to have an eternal fire because their spirits are immortal. So the fire has to be going on forever and ever and ever. And that's the way you ultimately subdue a rebellious spirit in the Enochic literature. As for the other angels, they are imprisoned in underground caverns and in places in heaven where they're awaiting final judgment. And the final judgment of the angels will come at the end of time, when God's purposes for mankind are finally worked out. So you have an entire scenario for the history of humanity up to the time when these texts appeared. Now, when did they appear? Well, how old is these books of Enoch? Well, we're not entirely certain, but we got some pretty good idea that the astronomical book, which describes the way heaven is run and the whole climate of the earth is controlled from heaven, this may go back to the 300s BC. The Book of the Watchers seems to stem very much from the early to mid 2nd century BC and is associated with certain political events at that time, which is themselves very key, and which impacted on the situation in Judea in Jesus' time. The latest aspect would be in the first century, early first century BC. So all these books precede the Christian experience and the Jesus movement, which gathers around those who believed that Jesus was the promised Messiah. And so they're part of the reading and part of the experience. I am absolutely convinced of the earliest so-called Nazarene movement. So that makes them critical texts for the understanding the origin of Christianity.
So when we think about them being left out of the canon, Tobias, I'm so interested in this, what you have to say about evil, right? That the angels are blamed for the evil. This seems like a contradiction to Augustine, like this is messing with his original sin. I had always understood that the Enoch was left out of the canon because the angels defied God and angels can't defy God, but this feels like another angle on this.
It depends what we mean by the canon here.
Well, I guess the Bible, as we our current Bible.
No. I don't. I'm not questioning in that sense. And what I'm saying is a canon is a late development. The Hebrew canon starts to be formulated after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. So I would be, and most scholars of the Book of Enoch today would say that the books of Enoch were regarded by some Jews and certainly some Christians as perfectly inspired by God scripture. The denial of the books of Enoch comes much later, and you mentioned Augustine. Now, Augustine's writing after 400 AD, very late on the day. And of course, he doesn't like the books of Enoch for the reason you said, that theologically he finds them impossible to swallow. He also can't understand how could angels sin. He questions that. So he questions the inclusion of the Book of Enoch in Christian as something part of Christian tradition. He questions it on the basis that these theological points mean that God cannot have been responsible for inspiring them. But if we look at the fact that the Epistle of Judas, or Jude as everyone will see it in their Bible, if you look at the Greek Judas, it's just the Greek form of a Judah. And the Epistle of Jude, which is in your New Testament, quotes copiously from the Book of the Watchers. And this is the only prophecy quoted in the entire Christian and Jewish Bible that is not in the Bible. There are quotes after quotes from Jeremiah, from Zechariah, from Isaiah, from Amos, from Hosea, from Joel, from Haggai, from you name it. You will find quotes from the Psalms, quotes from the Proverbs, quotes from here, quotes from there. You will not find another situation where you have a prophecy in the canon that the origin of it is not in the canon. This is quite extraordinary thing about Enoch. Now, Tertullian, one of the most important church fathers, writing in about 200 AD, he says we have no right to debate whether the Book of Enoch is scriptural, because it's in Jude. And if it's in Jude, that means God wanted it to be there, and it's part of our salvation story. And he says many Christians find it an important work. Origen, writing 50 to 100 years later, he says, well, he takes it as a canonical book. If he's not using the word canonical, his scripture, he's taking it as inspired scripture. He says, but it should be said there are some churches that don't accept it. They feel that it's false, and that Enoch couldn't have produced a book that had lasted that long. We're talking about a text going back to the beginnings of humanity. And there are sort of common sense arguments about it, saying, well, how could it have survived the flood anyway? And Tertullian answers, and he says, well, Noah could have memorized it, or perhaps he stashed a copy aboard, but anyway, if God wanted it to last, then it's bloody lasted, And in Justin Martyr and several other of the early church fathers, they accepted the Book of Enoch as part of the scriptural tradition that the early church drew upon. So its condemnation In fact, it was rabbis it was the rabbinic tradition that tended to reject it, and we can posit various reasons why that may have been. One of them may have been because it's an apocalyptic book, and there were, in the rabbinical movement, which replaces the old temple system, which the Romans are responsible for destroying at AD 70, the famous destruction of the temple. They would say that it's exactly this kind of apocalyptic overkill that's led to the downfall of our country. And it becomes suspicious. And they said, well, we just don't accept that it's canonical, that he's a real, that this Enoch is a real prophet. Obviously, one of the sticking points was the elaborate mythology within the Book of the Watchers. The notion of rebel angels itself, of falling in love with human beings, sort of jars. They say, how could God create angels and have it in his train something that is dangerous as this? It just seems counterintuitive to a certain way of thinking. However, you could argue exactly the same about the position of the Satan, Ha-Satan, that you have in the book of Job, for example. The position of the Satan means the adversary, and he's God's prosecuting counsel in heaven. And he's not presented as the principle of evil or a challenge to God, a profound incarnation of the most evil. He's not. What his job is in heaven is he says, I think this person's a sinner, and I'm going to show you that he is, and you can judge it. And that's the earliest presentation of the Satan. And the Satan is not a name like my name or your name. The Satan is is an office, the adversary, adversarial counsel. But in the apocalyptic period, 3rd century, 2nd century, 1st century BC, into the Jesus period, the role and the definition of this character is amplified until by the 1st century, all evil is ascribed to Satan, very much in the same way as the line in Enoch says that, to him ascribe all sin. So Azazel really is a kind of proto or parallel figure to the development of Satan. And we also have in Christian mythology today, you have William Blake did beautiful watercolors and engravings of the rebel angels led by Satan. And the legions, we have that idea of the legions of demons led by Satan. Well, those ideas appear to have been basically lifted from the account of Azazel and Shemhaza coming upon the earth at Mount Hermon, today on the Lebanese border, where I argue in the book that if there was an ascension, that was where it was originally placed. Ascension of Christ going back up to heaven. So there seems to be a link between Mount Hermon as a gateway to the higher world, which is consistent with all global mythology, where significant mountains, especially if you've got ice on top, tend to be associated with gateways to the divine. Olympus is another obvious example, and there are many more in India and the Far East where you have significant mountains. So it's no accident that that's where. But of course, if you come down on Mount Hermon, you're almost straight into the biblical Dan, which is New Testament Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" My guess is one of them would have said, "You've got to be Enoch." Because there are so many aspects of the Enoch figure that seem to be built into the conception of the Messiah. Or I say conceptions, different conceptions that Jewish writers had of the Messiah in before Jesus' time, and certainly during it. The identity of the Messiah is the big issue in the New Testament. What is a Messiah? What are his powers? What can you expect of him?
And it's interesting how you mentioned earlier that Enoch essentially transcended without death, where when Jesus returned, it was due to his own death itself. So there's an interesting parallel that kind of exists between the two of them also, as Enoch has this connection to the divine and the ability to kind of exist between them, whereas Jesus had to suffer to kind of get that connection reestablished for himself.
There's a phrase that some scholars use called parallelomania, which is that if two texts have similar ideas, that somehow one must be derived from the other. Scholars are very loath, quite rightly, to commit to those sort of ideas. What we're trying to do in the scholarly world is put texts in a kind of conversation with one another, and without jumping to radical conclusions because they look attractive or may gain attention. So, for example, and it's very important, this is probably one of the most important things for Christians anyway, and the Christian tradition, and the esoteric tradition, of course, traditions, I should say, is that the last part of the Enochic corpus included in First Enoch is generally called the similitude or parables of Enoch. Now, we should say that there have been fragments found at Qumran of all of first bits of the main parts of First Enoch, with the exception of the parables. That doesn't discount whether the Book of Parables was at Qumran. We only have a relatively small percentage of what we think may have been at Qumran or what hasn't survived. But it's almost certain from the content of the Book of Parables that it's a later work than certainly the astronomical book or the Book of the Watchers or even the Epistle of Enoch. So it's dated by scholars in the main today in about, we could say, from about the mid-1st century BC, very latest, very early years of the 1st century AD, which would mean it would be a hot text when Jesus is a boy and growing up, fairly new. And my guess is that his family were my guess is, that's not a gospel, my guess is that his family would have been aware of it, or the traditions around it. There seems to be a link between Enochic books and Galilee, which is also interesting. The main scholarship has been devoted to placing Enochic works in Qumran because that's where we found our earliest fragments. Seven fragments fragments of 7 copies of the books of First Enoch were found at Qumran, which has, by the way, revolutionized our view of it, because it used to be dismissed as a late Christian-influenced interpolation. It was, quote, pseudepigraphical, means it had false authorship. Well, you could say that about a great deal of scripture. False attribution. And of course, it's apocryphal, which has acquired an extra meaning that apocryphal used to mean a secret book or a book whose origin was secret or obscured. Now, in modern parlance, an apocryphal work usually means a doubtful origin, a doubtful source. And obviously, in canonical law, an apocryphal work is one that has no absolute authority for the making of doctrine. So it was dismissed as pseudepigraphical and apocryphal. These are scholars' conceptions. They're not. We can't say that was in the minds at all of the people who first wrote or read these works. And in the Book of Parables, this is the point, we have for the first time the description and functions of a figure called the Son of Man. Now, anyone who's been to church, read the Bible, will have found numerous occasions, references in the Gospels, not in the letters of Paul, but in the Gospels, to this figure, the Son of Man. In Mark, Jesus says that the Son of Man is going to be taken, he's going to be killed, which leads Peter to attack him. at Caesarea Philippi, which happens to be Dan, which is where in the books of Enoch, Enoch confronts Azazel, the leader of the wicked watchers. And a very interesting place, Dan. There was a temple there to Pan. It's also regarded as the ancient source of the Jordan, and it's right on the Damascus Road. And if I had to bet on where Paul had his experience, I'd say we're very close to it, the road of Damascus moment. That's a footnote to what I've been saying. Now, the Son of Man in the Book of Parables is described as the elect of God. He is God's literally right-hand man, so to speak, except he's not a man, but he is the image of man. The figure is thought to derive from the Book of Daniel, which is really contemporary to in terms of its authorship, is contemporary to the books of Enoch, about 160 BC. Now, in the Book of Daniel, you have a reference to one like a son of man. And he becomes a kind of, but it's not a title. One like a son of man means one like a human. Son of man in general, it means a son of Adam, meaning a human being. In the books of Enoch, in the parables, son of man is a title, as we're more used to hearing son of God as a title. Now, most people, I'm sure, when they hear scripture, and they hear the Son of Man, they probably feel a bit, who's this Son of Man? And they probably think, well, it's just, and many vicars will tell them, well, it's a sort of alternative to saying Son of God, except it emphasizes in this case that God has become man. So it's plugging up supporting the incarnation doctrine. So Son of Man, Son of God, sort of same thing. But the Book of Parables alerts us to the fact that no, by the time Jesus is mature, Son of Man is within Jewish culture as a title of a figure who will judge mankind, at the end of time. And he has a specific role. Now, that doesn't mean it's the same interpretation as you will find in the Gospels, where the Son of Man, of course, comes to earth as Jesus. He obviously sees himself as the Son of Man. You know, the fox has his lair, the bird has his nest, but the Son of Man has nowhere where to lay his head. He's come to earth, and he's like the wandering figure of wisdom in the Book of Enoch, who can't find a home, can't find his place, because, of course, he really belongs in heaven. And you have all these ideas are swimming around. There are real fascinating links between the salvific role of the Son of Man in parables and the self-designation of Yeshua ben Yosef, or as we know him as Jesus in the Gospels. I think this is one of obviously for people in the Christian tradition, esoteric or not esoteric, this is arresting. This has got to be confronted, cannot be denied. And I think now with the fabulous scholarship that's been done on this, this has got to be taken seriously. And so it would seem to me that the Son of Man designation is more important to the historical Jesus than the Son of God designation, which is much more the something somebody would say once had decided that Jesus was the Messiah indeed. So it's become a specific role. So I think if you don't find that interesting, well, I personally find it phenomenal, and I think to go into it in as I've done in the book and show what we've done, I think it's a revelatory.
Could you tell us a little bit? Your book starts with this beautiful, colorful, sort of exciting account of how Enoch comes to us today. Could you just give us a little bit of that?
Yeah, we have an explorer, an adventurer, a Scottish laird, James Bruce, and he goes in search of the Nile in the 1760s and 1770s, and he risks his life for many years trying to find the source of the Nile, and he gets all the way to Ethiopia, or Abyssinia as it was called then, which people just didn't do, because the conditions, once you went into Upper Egypt and beyond through what's today is the Sudan, and if you carried on, your chances of survival were extremely slim. Either you'd be robbed and murdered, or drowned, or eaten by crocodiles, or die of heat exhaustion, or just any number of things could happen. But James Bruce headed off, and he got to know the Emperor Tekle Hayamot of Ethiopia, and was introduced to the Tewahedo Orthodox Church. This was almost unique experience. And in fact, when he came back, a lot of people denied he'd even had this experience. Now, it had been known since the mid-1500s by Guillaume Postel, a French esotericist and quite brilliant scholar, linguist, amongst many other talents. He had met an Ethiopian priest in Paris in the 1550s who'd said, "We have the Book of Enoch." And there was always some excitement among scholars, biblical scholars, that the lost, but you've got to remember the Book of Enoch is lost to the Western world by the end of the Roman Empire period. So by the late 5th century, you're hard pressed to find any copy, and it disappears as a text, and it's not available. It doesn't appear to be available to scholars, Islamic scholars also after the 7th century. They don't have access to the text either. But it appears that in Ethiopia, it was not only available, but it was in fact sitting comfortably within the Bible in the canon next to the Book of Job. That's certainly how James Bruce found it. And he had a special copy made. He had 4 copies made. One he gave to the Pope in 1774. One he gave to the King of France. Another one he kept himself, and I gave one eventually to the University of Oxford. I'm sorry, he gave one to the King of England. His own copy eventually came the way of the University of Oxford. And it wasn't even known until recently that one had gone to the Pope. The Pope certainly didn't advertise the fact he'd got one because nobody could read it. It was written in Ge'ez, the language of Ethiopia, the written language of the Ethiopia of that time. So we're talking about 1773. So we haven't even got to Lexington and Concord yet, really, unless I've missed it slightly out with that one. But we're talking that period. We're talking. We're coming into the closing overs of American independence, so to speak. Closing overs is a cricket term, but he brings it back, and nobody can translate it. This is the problem, and so it kind of languishes. There are attempts made to translate it. He claimed that he was going to do it, but his Ge'ez clearly wasn't nearly good enough. Now they had extracts from the Book of Enoch which had been reproduced in Greek texts primarily from the ancient world, and attempts were made to most of the attempts to translate it originally were basically using extracts they already knew about, and there was a lot of guesswork, but nobody could really crack it efficiently. And in fact, a translation isn't produced until I think it's 1821 by an Anglo-Irish bishop, and when it comes out in the 1820s, it's kind of muted interest, because he presents it as very much an apocryphal work, etc. But he frames his presentation in a way, say, it's almost, the subtext is, don't think this is sensational. It's just a funny Jewish work that's sort of come through. Anyway, got to publish it. It's only right, I've translated it, done my best with it. Here we are. And it didn't make much of a stir, except in Germany. So several German scholars realized, my God, hang on, mein Gott, das verhüten Spürens, what is this? In Germany, it starts to make quick progress as a scholarly important work. Same thing happens in France. But even so, right through the 19th century, it doesn't get traction. Nobody's quite sure who's written it, who wrote it in the first place. They know by then you've got 2,000 years nearly of church tradition telling you that it's non-canonical, can't be trusted, not God's word, not scriptural. And for that reason, it doesn't really make much of an impact on believers generally, because there's no way of presenting it to them that they can grasp its significance. So we're in a totally different position today. There are a lot of people interested in these matters. They are aware that certain things have been, shall we say, subdued in significance and apparently kept from them. I don't. A lot of these claims are spurious. Seek and ye shall find, as Jesus said. You've had to search these things out. I had to search it out. My education as a theologian didn't encourage me to go very far into the matter. That's because I took that decision myself to go in my own search for the Nile, as it were, in considerably less hostile circumstances to good old James Bruce, whose descendants, by the way, are alive and kicking in Scotland, and indeed, I think we interviewed his direct descendant, who's was head of Scottish Freemasonry, interestingly enough. They're direct descendants of Robert the Bruce, Robert le Bruce, who is claimed as a Scottish hero, but I think his family, you'll find, probably came from, I can't remember, it was Flanders or Brittany. But anyway, he's basically a Norman. But not to worry, he liked Scotland and wanted to stay there. And he did fight Edward I at Bannockburn, so he's a Scottish hero. And perhaps Mel Gibson will make a film about him as well. Oh, he did, didn't he? He called it Braveheart, and Robert the Bruce has a little part in it. But he's not covered in woad like the Mel Gibson character. We're getting sidetracked. So back to the Book of Enoch. So James Bruce brings it back. It produces a bit of a scandal. When Bruce is in Italy on his way back in 1774, the scholars in Italy think he's a bit too much of a big head. He gets involved in a couple of romantic scandals. These Scottish aristocrats, and they can't take him seriously, and most people don't even believe really what they're living. And of course, it's very difficult to believe in the content of a text that nobody can translate properly. So until there's a Ge'ez, so it takes then another virtually 50 years before there is somebody who's capable of the translation. Now, the most effective translation in terms of its currency, and if you go on the internet today, it says free PDF of the Book of Enoch, is one by R.H. Charles, which first of all came out in the 1890s. He revised it, and it becomes a standard text after 1912. And that's the one I read, which is an excellent translation, but it's not absolutely perfect. There are numerous scholarly translations since, but to my mind, none of them have the style. R.H. Charles gets the style of the book, it seems to me, in a way that you can translate things in a very literal way. I mean, if you read a literal translation of the book of Genesis, for example, absolutely literal to the Hebrew, it doesn't have much poetry left in it when it's turned into English. Whereas we're used to variants on the King James Version, which was produced by people who were instructed to write a version that had sonorous musicality and an elevated form of speech, and it happened to be the golden era of English prose. So we were very lucky to get that. So the R.H. Charles version is very, very good, and I think for most people will get you the main ideas. But I think you'll find in my text where to look if you want to go more deeply into the etymology of the language, and there are variant readings. Charles didn't like the idea, for example, R.H. Charles didn't like the idea that at the end of the Book of Parables, Enoch becomes the Son of Man. And that is actually in the text. Enoch is chosen by God uniquely, to become the son of man. By the time we get to the second book of Enoch, which is produced, we think, sometime in the 1st century, so it's a period of Jesus, Paul, and the first apostles, he's elevated into a position. He's called the little Yahweh or Javeh. He's almost a version of God. I mean, if you think of Austin Powers, he's little me. If God is the opposite of Dr. Evil, of course, little Enoch becomes little me. And he is called the son, and he becomes the son of man to such a degree that his entire skin, his eyes are transformed, and he becomes, in a marvelous description, make very good film, he is turned into an archangel. And after that, contact with earth is perilous to him. Now, there's a nice anticipation of the War of the Worlds conclusion. There's some wonderful Islamic paintings of their Enoch, who's called Idris. The Islamic Enoch is Idris, and it appears in the Quran. If you look at some of the Islamic Persian drawings of him, you see him, Enoch on earth, with a veil across his face. And the veil is so that his gaze does not destroy human beings who gaze upon him, because he's from this super spiritual, super celestial, heavenly origin. So he can only come back to earth for short periods, and at some peril to those who meet him. He doesn't eat. He doesn't need to eat. He's now a fully fledged celestial archangelic being. Now, how does that resonate? How does that resonate with origins of Christology? He sits on the right hand of God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. From thence he shall come to judge the quick and the dead. You can almost substitute the name of Enoch. This is all very interesting.
I'm just taking everything in. I'm sorry. Tobias, where, moving forward, can people find you? Where can we find some of your additional works?
Well, I have a little modest, very modest website called tobiaschurton.com. And there's the list of the books and links of how you can get hold of them, and reviews of them there, and also my music and other aspects of my quite long career now. So that's, or you can go on Amazon if you want, or Barnes & Noble, and put in Tobias Churton, and you'll get plentiful reading material on subjects that I think people get quite rightly hooked on. Insofar as I'm not a sensationalist writer. I do not attempt to take one fact and try and turn it into a great theory. I don't like speculation. Occasionally, the facts, as one can get close to them, suggest one might occasionally speculate a possibility, but they should always be flagged up with a big red flag. Speculation, only my thoughts, no proof. We want to get to things that are verifiable and aim for the truth. As my ancestor, Archdeacon Churton, said, the only thing worth contending for is the truth. Contending, if you're not familiar with the word, means to fight over, or to get into debate over, or to argue about. It's only the truth. Now, if you're going to argue about the truth, you better get your facts right, not invent them, as so many books do these days.
This was a fantastic conversation, and I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yes, absolutely.
I think this is important work, and you won't lose by it.
Yes, an excellent book too, and I recommend it to our listeners for sure.
Thank you.